Jesus said, this world you're going to have turmoil. He said, be of good cheer. I've overcome this world. He said he would give us his peace, and I'm so thankful for that tonight. We are going to be looking at the 21st verse of the 11th chapter of Hebrews, just that one verse, but you can go back over into Genesis to the 48th chapter. That's basically where we're going to be at tonight, is Genesis, the 48th chapter. But Hebrews 11:21 says, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. When you look at the overall picture of the book of Hebrews, the writer of the Hebrew book knew that the Christians in that day were going to have a life of persecution. He knew that it was not going to be easy to be a Christian for them in the culture that they lived in. And so he knew that they were Jews. They were leaving behind that old Jewish religion, and now they were becoming followers of Jesus Christ. They were no longer going to be accepted by their Jewish communities. They were no longer going to be accepted by their Jewish families or their Jewish friends. They were becoming outcasts in the society that they lived in. And the writer of Hebrews knew that they were going to need encouragement, and they were going to need help as they journeyed forward with Jesus, being outcasts, leaving behind that Jewish life and becoming followers of Jesus. And he told them in the book of Hebrews, he told them that the just were going to live by faith. And that is a quote that comes out of Habakkuk where it says, the just shall live by faith. That's also given again over in the book of Romans. Paul tells those people that. But this Hebrew writer was describing what their life was going to be like here on earth as outcasts, as followers of Jesus Christ, how they could walk and live a life of faith. And he went back and he gave them examples of people that they were familiar with here in this 11th chapter. He talked about Abraham. He talked about Sarah. He talked about Enoch, and he talked about Abel. He talked about a lot of Old Testament characters that they would have been familiar with because they knew the law. They knew all of those old scrolls and stories in the Old Testament. And Jacob, who shows up here in this 21st chapter, he is one of the people that the Hebrew writer used as an encouragement to these new followers of Jesus. His story, which is found here in Genesis, scattered throughout Genesis, is the story of Jacob. His life was not always a life of faith. Jacob had a lot of issues. I mean, from the time he was born, he was a rascal. What did his name mean? We talked about that last week. You remember? Conniver, heel grabber. He is one who was an opportunist, always looking to take advantage of someone else. He stole his brother's birthright. He, through deception, got his father's blessing. And then when his brother Esau, who was a wild man, red and hairy and a hunter in the fields, was angry about being robbed of his birthright and the blessing of his father, he ran from him. He feared what would happen because he knew he dwelt in the tents. He had soft hands. He was a mama's boy. He was no match for his twin brother Esau. He could take him down. So he ran from him and he hid. And even though God had spoke promises of blessing into his life, God had told Jacob's mother that he was going to be the one who was going to receive the blessing. He knew that, but he didn't really understand what those blessings were going to be. And so he was always chasing after a blessing, but he was chasing after the wrong blessings. And because of that, he ended up living a really rough life. He had a lot of trials. He had a lot of pain in his life. And one of the greatest pains in his life, I think, probably occurred when his favorite son, Joseph, disappeared. And he thought that he was dead. He had had sons, multiple sons, by 4 different women. And he took the son of Rachel, who was Joseph, And what did he give him as a sign of his affection, that he was his favorite son? Yeah, gave him that beautiful coat of many colors. And Joseph was younger than his other brothers, and he was despised by all of those brothers because they thought that he was the dad's favorite, and that he always got the best of everything. And eventually Joseph had a dream that God was going to put him in a position of power, a position of prominence over his brothers, and that they were all going to bow down to him. And when he told his family about those dreams, surprise, surprise, they were not impressed. They hated him. And then they began to try to decide how they were going to get rid of him. Because that was the last straw. Not only was he the favorite, but now he's telling them, I'm going to be better than you, and I'm going to have control and rule over you. And so eventually the brothers did what to Joseph? Sold him into slavery. And they made up a story that a wild beast had killed him, and they took his beautiful coat that his dad had given him, dipped it in the blood of an animal, and took it back to Jacob and said, "Oh, Father, look what we found. How sad that your sweet baby boy has come to this end." And they let their dad grieve the loss of Joseph. Jacob believed that tale, and as the years went by, when you read the story of Joseph, you realize that God was faithful to Joseph. Jacob had no idea all that was happening behind the scenes with his son. He thought he was dead and continued to grieve him all those years. But we know that a famine came upon the land, and one day Jacob said, "We're all going to die if we don't get some food somewhere." And so he sent his sons into Egypt to get grain for his family. And by that time, through the divine hand of God, Joseph had survived some tough times after he was sold into slavery. He went to be a servant in Potiphar's house, and Potiphar's wife made goo-goo eyes at him. And when he would not do what she wanted him to do, then she claimed that he tried to sexually assault her and got him put in prison. But when he was in prison, God had favor over him, and he became the ruler over the prison and in charge of everything. And eventually he was released into the house of Pharaoh, and then he became over all of Pharaoh's house. I mean, everything that he did, even though it was not easy, God was there. God was with Joseph. And over again in the Old Testament it says God was with him and blessed him until he came to be second in command in the land of Egypt. And you look at the life of Jacob, even though he didn't know anything that was going on in Joseph's life, all the while that God was blessing Joseph and elevating Joseph and putting Joseph into position that Joseph didn't ask for. He didn't seek after those blessings. He just did what was right, and God blessed him because he did what was right. Jacob, on the other hand, wasn't always concerned with doing what was right. Jacob was concerned with building his flocks. He was concerned with gaining wealth. He was concerned with having a big family so that he could gain physical, material blessings. But his life was very hard as he sought after those physical blessings. His beloved wife Rachel died in childbirth in Genesis the 35th chapter. Reuben, his oldest son, betrayed his own father by having a relationship with one of Jacob's concubines, or one of his wives there in Genesis the 35th chapter. And then his daughter was assaulted, and Jacob's sons then went to the village where those perpetrators were, wiped out the entire village in revenge for what had happened to their sister. He lived much of his life grieving and believing that his son Joseph had been killed by those wild beasts. And he then endured all of this famine and struggle to provide for his family that we begin to read about in Genesis the 42nd chapter. And though all he wanted were blessings, what he really got were battles. When he was in his old age, he was reunited with Joseph there in Egypt, and he met Joseph's boss, who was the Pharaoh. And he said to Pharaoh in Genesis 47:9, He said, few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the years of the life of my fathers. He was basically saying, this journey of life that I've been on has been a painful journey, and there have been a lot of bad things that have happened to me along the way. But when we come to this point where we're at in Hebrews, the 11th chapter, the 21st verse, where it says that by faith, Jacob, as he was dying, blessed the sons of Joseph. We begin to see that Jacob in his dying moments did what many people do when it comes down to the end of their life. And they're looking back at what happened in their life, and they realize they have such little time left. He began to see clearly who God was and what the real blessings of God were. Suddenly, the son that he thought he had lost was there before him. And not only was Joseph there, but Joseph's sons were there. Not only did he gain his son back, but now he began to see his offspring. And in their day and in their culture, to have a large family was an honor. And to have children who had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, that was seen as a huge honor. The more you had, the more affluent you were, the more people revered you if you had that large extended family. And we also know that in this 21st verse of Hebrews, the 11th chapter, it says that Jacob was leaning on his staff. And that's important because why would Jacob have needed a staff? Do you think that was just for that time when he was dying? Or would he have needed a staff before that?
He might just have been weak.
He might have been weak. Can you think of an event in his life that happened that...
Oh, when he wrestled.
Yeah, when he wrestled with God. What happened? It says that God touched the inner part of his thigh, basically dislocated his hip, and he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. That staff that he had is probably the one he'd been carrying since the wrestling match with God. And it was a constant reminder to him of the power of God and who God was. And as he leaned on that staff, as he was getting ready to bless the sons of Joseph, it says that he worshiped. He worshiped right before he was dying. At that point in his life, Jacob really didn't have great wealth because he'd left everything behind because of the famine. He was losing everything. He was in a strange land. His health was failing. He didn't even have good health anymore. But what did he have? He had God. And he began to realize that God was enough. And I think that's so important for us to stop and think about. We spend our whole life scrapping for money. We spend our whole life working and trying to get this and trying to get that. And, you know, we worry about accumulating retirement plans and all of those things. But when it comes down to the very last hours and minutes of your life, what's important? God's important. Because you suddenly realize, not only do I need God for this life, I need God in that moment of death, because it's a scary thing to die without Jesus in your heart and your life. You need the reassurance that He's going to be right there. He's going to carry us into heaven. You know, that's going to be a moment that for us who know God, it's just another step in the journey. It's another step closer to God when we pass. And we certainly need God in eternity, because that's where we want to be for all of eternity, is with God in heaven. And so in those last moments, if we're where we ought to be spiritually, and we begin to see clearly, those are moments of worship. Those are moments of joy in our lives. And that's where Jacob was. Nothing else mattered. His faith at that moment became something it had never been before. He had great faith in who God was, what God was able to provide for him, all those blessings he had chased after all of his life. He was like, oh God, I realize now those were not the blessings that I needed. The blessings that I needed were the spiritual blessings. And he also wanted to pass those spiritual blessings on to his children and his grandchildren. And so you begin to see in Jacob's life that he was moving from being that person who was looking for material blessing to a person who understood the power and the good of having spiritual blessings. And sometimes we can be guilty of craving the wrong kind of blessings. Sometimes we want those physical blessings, and we get confused and we think if we don't have all of those physical blessings, then we must not be as close to God as we need to be. But the amount of blessings that we have has nothing to do with our relationship with God. We can't get caught up in this health and wealth and prosperity gospel. Sick people have a good relationship with God. Poor people can have a great relationship with God. Uneducated people can have a great relationship with God. It's not about having money. It's not about having health. It's not about having degrees and huge jobs. It's about seeing God for who God is. We want stuff sometimes, but we don't necessarily want the Savior. We're guilty of that in America. We want the blessings, but we don't want God, who is the giver of the blessings. There's a song, I don't know how many of you all know it, and I posted this on Facebook today, but the chorus of that song says, "Help me want the healer more than the healing. Help me want the Savior more than the saving. Help me want the giver more than the giving. Oh, help me to want you, Jesus, more than anything." And that's really where we have to be. Because if you're always looking for perfect health, if you're always looking to have everything in your life go like clockwork, if you're always looking to have an easy life, you're going to be disappointed all the time because you're going to think that God's letting you down. But that's not true. The spiritual blessings of having that relationship with God far outweigh all of the literal things that we can get from God in this life. But I believe that Jacob began to see that he really needed God more than he needed anything in that moment and in that time. And he leaned on that. It says at the end of his life, when you read here in this 48th chapter, it says that at the end of his life, he pulled up his legs and he went to sleep. He died there in the bed. We're going to read that 48th chapter. If someone has that open, why don't you read the 48th chapter? Somebody can read verses 1 through 10, and then somebody read 11 through 20.
And it came to pass after these things that one told Joseph, "Behold, thy father is sick," and he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And one told Jacob and said, "Behold, thy son Joseph cometh unto thee," and Israel strengthened himself and sat upon the bed. And Jacob said unto Joseph, "God Almighty appeared unto me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and blessed me, and said unto me, Behold, I will make thee fruitful and multiply thee, and I will make of thee a multitude of people, and will give this land to thy seed after thee for an everlasting possession. And now thy two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, which were born unto thee in the land of Egypt, before I came unto thee into Egypt, are mine. As Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine. And thy issue, which thou begettest after them, shall be thine, and shall be called after the name of their brethren in their inheritance. And as for me, when I came from Padan, Rachel died by me in the land of Canaan in the way, when yet there was but a little way to come unto Ephrath. And I buried her there in the way of Ephrath, the same is Bethlehem. And Israel beheld Joseph's sons, and said, Who are these? And Joseph said unto his father, They are my sons, whom God hath given me in this place. And he said, Bring them, I pray thee, unto me, and I will bless them. Now the eyes of Israel were dim for age, so that he could not see. And he brought them near unto him, and he kissed them and embraced them.
Someone want to read 11 through 20.
And Israel said to Joseph, I had not thought to see your face, but in fact God has also shown me your offspring. So Joseph brought them from beside his knees, and he bowed down with his face to the earth. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh with his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near him. Then Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, guiding his hands knowingly, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads, let my name be named upon them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. Now when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. So he took hold of his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, Not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. So he blessed them that day, saying, By you Israel will bless, saying, May God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh. And thus he set Ephraim before Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, Behold, I am dying, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you one portion above your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow.
Yeah, and so here in this 48th chapter, here's the end. Jacob knows this is it, the end. And you've got 3 generations that are there in that room. You have Jacob, you have Joseph, and then you have Joseph's 2 sons. And it says that Jacob mustered the last little bit of strength that he had, and he raised up in bed to pronounce this blessing upon them, upon Ephraim and Manasseh. Here, as he does this blessing on these boys, in verses 3 and 4, you see that Jacob shares with them basically a testimony of the goodness of God and the faithfulness of God and the blessing of God on his life when he had a powerful encounter with God in a place called Luz, L-U-Z, and you can read about that in Genesis, the 28th chapter, when he saw that ladder in heaven and he saw the angels going up and down and he slept on the rock that night. He had that great encounter with God where he said it was an awesome experience. It was an awesome place where he was at. And he told his grandsons the promise that he received from God there, where God told him that he was going to gather to himself a community of people from every nation that we know today is the church of God, all the believers, all the blood washed from around the world. That's what he was prophesying and telling him was going to happen. And Jacob is really passing on the legacy to his grandsons there. He's saying, there's more to this life than what you see in front of you. God has a great plan for your life. This is what he told me. This is what I've experienced. I have this amazing encounter with God. And so many times when we come down to our last moments in life, those last words are the most impactful. That's the time when you're not talking about the weather, and you're not talking about the Wildcats, and you're not talking about all these other things. You're honed in because you know this is my last chance. I got to tell everybody around me what's important. And what's important is the purpose and the plan that God has for your life. And he said, I met God. I saw and I heard the promise of God. And that promise wasn't just for me, but it's for your dad, it's for you, it's for your children who are going to come after you. God is going to do great things through this family. He's casting a vision for them, telling them they need to follow after God. And in Joel, the 1st chapter, the 3rd verse, Joel says the same thing. He says, tell your children about it, and let your children tell their children, and their children to another generation. You know what? This great relationship that we have with God is something that doesn't need to stop with us. We need to continue to tell the story. We need to continue to share with our children and our grandchildren. And even if they're not walking with the Lord, they still need to hear the story of what God has done in our lives and what He wants to do in their life. And then we just trust that God's going to drop that deep into their heart, and He is going to call that back to their remembrance at some point in their life and use that to steer them back onto the path that they need to be on. Deuteronomy 29:29 says, the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our children forever. And so whatever it is that God has revealed to you, you need to be revealing to your children and to your grandchildren, so that this truth and this legacy lives on in their lives. Jacob not only shares his testimony about the greatness of God here, but he also prays over them. Here, a couple of things that Jacob says in verses 5 through 20 of this 48th chapter. He says, it tells us that when you look at this picture up here, what do you notice about Jacob? He's got his arms crossed. Yeah, because when Joseph brought those boys to him, he put the oldest on the right-hand side of Jacob, and he put the youngest on the left-hand side, because the oldest in their society was the one that was supposed to receive the blessing, the birthright. Jacob was the youngest in his family, wasn't he? And Esau was the oldest. He stole the birthright, the blessing from his brother. But here in this, he actually goes against what tradition was. He goes against what their culture was, and he gives the blessing to the younger one. Why do you think he would do that? What does that speak to us today? What's important about him breaking with their culture and with what was normally happening, tradition? Have any idea?
Joseph probably had a lot to do with that, you know. That's a different route to go, but he was quite a man.
He was, but you know, Joseph wanted him to bless his oldest son. He said, Dad, he tried to move his hands. He said, he thought he was old and blonde and didn't know what he was doing. He's like, oh no, this is the oldest one, put your hand here. And his dad's like, no, this is the way that I want to do it. And I wonder, this is just my speculation, if when we look at that for us today, you know, we have to look at the fact that God's blessings, God's gift of salvation isn't given to us based on rank. It's not given to us based on our status in this world, not given to us based on our position in our family, or how moral we are, or all the work that we have done. But our blessings come from God because of the faith that we have in Jesus Christ. And so it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're the firstborn or the lastborn, or if you're the middle in your family. It doesn't matter what your bank account is. We all can receive the blessing of God. We don't have to go by tradition. We don't have to go by what is normal in our society to receive blessings. God's kingdom and God's way is upside down and backwards from the ways of this world. So when I look at that, I just think it's kind of pointing forward to the fact that in Jesus, we all have equal access We don't have to follow tradition. We don't have to do things the way they've always been done. We just have to have faith in Jesus Christ. Any thoughts about that?
Do you think that Jacob knew Joseph's sons very well?
No, I don't, because, let's see, where's it at here? It says, verse number 8 of 48, there, chapter 48, it says, when Israel or Jacob saw Joseph's sons, he said, who are these? And Joseph said to his father, they are my sons whom God has given me here. And he said, bring them to me, please, that I may bless them. And so he didn't know who they were.
Yeah, I remember reading that now. I just thought maybe he might have known them by their personalities, and he knew one might have been better,
Yeah.
you know.
No, it doesn't give us an indication that that was the case with that. So he shares a testimony with them, then he prays over them and he blesses them. And in verse 15, Jacob describes God in my translation, I don't know what yours says, but he describes God as the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day. And that's pretty interesting that he would describe God as his shepherd. Jacob had a rough life. He had a lot of bad things happen to him. You know, he had a bad relationship with his dad. He had a terrible relationship with his brother Esau. He loved Rachel, but he was deceived and he was given Leah on the night of the wedding. And then he labored 14 years to pay off the debt that he had to pay to get Rachel as his wife. And then he gets her and she can't have any kids. And so she's barren, and he has a daughter who's raped, who has 2 sons who, you know, killed the entire village. And his son Reuben sleeps with his wife, and then they take off with his son Joseph and sell him. And then Rachel dies during childbirth. In chapter 47, you know, he has so much going on in his life. And all he wanted out of all of that was just to have the blessings of God. But he says in chapter 47, he says his days were few, his days were evil. Yet God had been his shepherd his entire life. And I think he probably was acknowledging that even though I tried to do it my way, and it caused a lot of trouble, God was right there with me the whole time, trying to lead me, trying to guide me, trying to take me in the direction that I need to go. And this is the first time in the Bible that God is referred to as a shepherd. And from that point on, multiple times, we have this image of God being a shepherd, one who, as Jacob says, never left him through the entire time. And it sounds just like Jesus, doesn't it? Who said in John the 10th chapter, I'm the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. God never left Jacob. Jacob recognized that as he came near the end of his life. And I think for many of us, when we come down to the end of our life, we can look back, no matter how hard the path has been, no matter how many times we tried to do it our way, we look back and we can see where the Good Shepherd has been with us every step of the way. And those are times when, just like Jacob, even on our deathbed, we can worship God. And we can share with our families the faithfulness of God in that moment and in that time. And we can pass our faith on to our families by sharing that testimony, by praying over them, and by sharing the promise of God. As Jacob promises in the 21st verse of this chapter, he says, let me find it here. Then Israel or Jacob said to Joseph, I am bound to die. But here's the promise. But God will be with you, and he will bring you again to the land of your ancestors. That's the same promise that we have. God will be with us. Jesus said in Matthew 28:20, behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. And that is a promise that we have. even at the moment of death, God's gonna be there. He's gonna take us to the land of our ancestors. Where is that land? That land is heaven. And by faith, we can know that. We can have peace, we can have assurance in our heart, and not only for ourselves, but we share that faith with our families. And our families can have that same peace and that same assurance in their hearts when we pass from this world, that all is well. And what a blessing it is. That's the last gift that you give your family. Do you realize that? For them to know that all is well between you and the Lord. And that, yes, they can be sad if you're no longer here, but they don't have to grieve the way other people grieve, because they know you're in a better place. They know that you're in the care of the Lord for all of eternity, and you are no longer sick, no longer hurting, no longer dealing with all of those things. And so by faith, Jacob, as he was dying, leaned on that staff. He worshiped the Lord for his goodness through his whole life. And he shared with his family the goodness of God. He prayed over his family. He passed that blessing on to them of the greatness that God wanted to do through their family. And he also shared with them, this is the promise of God. The same promise I have, you have. Now you live it out. We have that same promise today in our life. Any thoughts or any comments about this life of Jacob and about the blessing of his sons? Or why you think he gained a place of prominence in this heroes of the faith?